Hello and welcome to another episode of the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast. This is John Jantsch. My guest today is Kelly Campbell. Kelly speaks and writes about trauma, leadership, and consciousness, something she calls the new TLC. She's also the author of Heal to Lead, Revolutionizing Leadership Through Trauma Healing. Kelly is a trauma-informed leadership coach to emerging and established leaders who know they are meant for more. So, Kelly, welcome to the show.
Hey, John, thank you so much for having me.
All right, so we're going to talk a lot about trauma, pretty weighty topic, perhaps, but let's maybe start with how do you define trauma?
Yeah, that's a great place to start because I think that there's a lot of misconception around that. A lot of people have this idea that it has to be something that's really big and really impactful, and that's not actually true. So trauma, the way that, or the definition that I've come across that I love the most, is really just unintegrated energy and information. So I'll say that a different way, for everyone to wrap their heads around. When we have situations or experiences where our nervous system doesn't have the ability to cope with them, that becomes trauma. And that's how trauma is stored in our body. So it's really just an overwhelm of the nervous system. And so when I say it's unintegrated information, the nervous system's inability to integrate what it's being given or what it's on the receiving end of, that's where, if that gets sort of remains unresolved or unprocessed, that's where we get into tricky territory and where it becomes problematic because then it's kind of floating around and coming back and really causing some maladaptive behaviors. But we'll get into all of that, as we continue to talk.
It sounds like, when you talk about energy that is loose, it almost sounds like the electrical cord that's like frayed in some places. And it's like, you
Yeah.
never know what kind of damage it's going to cause, right?
That's a great analogy. That really is a great analogy. When a cord like that's electrified gets cut and it almost has like a mind of its own, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
There's something else driving you. And so that's why, sometimes you might have a reaction or a response that feels to the other person very just not in line with what the reaction should be or what they're expecting. And
Right.
sometimes it's because of that loose wire that you're talking about.
Um, I don't want to be a complete downer, but I'm getting ready to be. Um, the statistics on some horrible things that happen to people that cause trauma, are pretty sad. But as a whole, especially since you've definitely broadened the definition of trauma, um, how many like in 10, people that are in, especially as you apply to leadership roles, I mean, is this really impact? I mean, how
10
big a
out of
deal
10.
is this? I guess is what I was saying.
Yeah, 10 out of 10.
Yeah, yeah.
It's 10 out of 10 because here's the deal. None of us have had a perfect childhood, right? And this isn't about blaming your caregivers or your parents. This is about really understanding how trauma impacts all of us. And that could be what some people call big T trauma, those big, impactful, more
Mhm.
quote unquote obvious things. Maybe being in a household where your parents were getting divorced, or maybe you grew up in a war-torn country where physical safety was, a big deal, and not available to you, right? So things that have shaped your worldview that were very impactful. That's what we typically call big T trauma. We think about those things along the lines of the ACEs study, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente study from the late 1990s. And it kind of gave us a framework of 10 to 12 things, two of which I just mentioned. But that's not where it stops, right? And so if it stopped there, then maybe we could say, all right, well, that might have impacted 2/3 of people. If we broaden that a little bit and understand the reality of the situation, my nervous system and your nervous system are two different nervous systems, right? And so what might be impactful to you might not be to me and vice versa. So when we're younger and we have what we might call small T traumas, things where or experiences where we're made to feel embarrassed or shamed
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
abandoned or betrayed or humiliated, all of these other, I would call them maybe like death by a thousand paper cuts, right? On their own, they might be impactful, but many times the small T traumas are continuous. And so that's where it really starts to erode our sense of self and really becomes the foundation for how we see ourselves in the world.
So I've always felt that leadership, good and bad, is really an act of or lack of self-awareness.
Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of people that I suspect listen to this. I throw myself in this category, frankly. I'd say nothing really bad happened to me. I mean, I can't identify really anything. And, you know, I, I was never hungry. I was never bullied. I was, those kinds of things. But so how do somebody who maybe is thinking that, how do you uncover the fact that you've said every single one of us has this at some level?
Yeah, well, you've touched upon it a little bit already, right? You're automatically thinking, I never went hungry, I was never neglected, right? I never maybe
Yeah.
had physical abuse. Those are only big T traumas, right? So you're not thinking about all of the other times when
I did have a teacher
maybe,
that told me I would never amount to anything one time. I do remember that one.
and the fact that you can recall that
Yeah. Right.
lets me know that that actually did impact you. And there might have been other things along those lines where even if they were just verbal, right? Like
Yeah.
we tend to downplay, oh, well, it was just verbal or get over it, kid, or right. That made you tougher or you had to, overcome something, this whole like resilience culture. Those things over time really do impact. And so what you touched upon before about self-awareness, right? If you're self-aware enough to understand that when you get feedback, for example, as a leader, and all of a sudden you feel angry, you feel defensive, you want to be right, you want to
Yeah.
challenge it. That might indicate that there might be something in your past where, that's a similar situation had occurred. And maybe you feel like you're being, um, I don't know, accused of something that isn't true. Right. So I would kind of maybe
Yeah.
try
Yeah.
to trace
Yeah. Yeah.
that back. If it's me, I'm going to try to trace that back because
Yeah.
I'm a
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
emotional detective. But that's not really what matters, right? What matters more is, are the ways in which you're showing up as a leader creating psychological safety for other people? Are you showing up in ways where you're inviting curiosity and innovation and collaboration with your teams? Right. And if you're reactive versus responsive, two different things, then you're not creating those environments. So that
Yeah.
self-awareness piece is really important.
So how have you seen some of the things we're talking about show up in maybe good ways and bad ways for people that are either aspire to be leaders or, in some cases thrust into leadership roles?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, emerging and established leaders,
Yeah.
we're all human, right? So
Yep.
it's just one has a little bit more experience than the other. Some of the ways I see this sort of manifest, and I talk about in the book, I talk about this bifurcation between, or not even bifurcation, it's really a spectrum between people pleasing leaders and people
Yeah.
controlling leaders. And you and I can be each of these things, or pieces of these things on any given day, right? So people pleasing might look like taking on a lot on your plate.
Mm.
Uh, Maybe, because you're taking so much on and you're trying to make sure that everyone else has a great experience, making sure everyone's happy on your team, you're going to take on so much that some things are inevitably going to fall. And so you become a little unreliable. You might also be pleasing to other people with a little bit of an underlying motivation, right? Again, this is subconscious. You're not doing this consciously, but you want the attention or praise or gratitude from your employees. And so if you don't get that, right, if you're pleasing and trying to make their lives happier and you don't get that respect or even reciprocation, you might start to get resentful, right? Then you might become a little passive aggressive. So there's all of these really interesting and very nuanced ways. Sometimes they're not as visible as others. So that's more on the people pleasing end. On the people controlling end of the spectrum, it's a lot more obvious and it's a lot more predictable. So these are your authoritative, get
Yep.
over it. We don't have time for those emotions in the workplace. Taking credit for other people's work, making sure that some people don't get promoted because they maybe are too much of a threat to your authority or your power. Speaking down to other people, making sure that you keep that balance of power at all times. Again, sometimes these things can be conscious, but most times they're not. So, lots and lots of ways that that shows up. And then, of course, that trickles down into the organization, whatever kind of organization you run.
Would you say that it, these traits, not the right word,
Yeah,
these
traits can be.
behaviors,
Yeah. Yeah.
behaviors that you're describing, I mean, they aren't unique to the workplace, right? I mean, they show up at the little league, manager, and they show up at, like, church. I mean, right? I mean, it's kind of just people being who they are, conscious or unconscious. Would you say that's true?
100%. And that's a great point, is that this isn't just relegated to a boardroom or something
Right.
like that. This really is the little league coach who's power hungry and yelling
Right.
at the kids, right? Like we've all
Yeah.
seen these things.
Yeah.
And many times we have been these things or are these things.
Yeah.
So it's easy to see it in other people. It's a little harder to recognize it in
Sure.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so far, at least, we've probably been talking about at the personal level. Let's talk a little bit at the organizational level. People bring you into organizations to, maybe work with folks that maybe they've identified something that needs to be worked on, or maybe it's just, hey, we know these will all be better people with this work. But organizationally, what have you seen have been some of the benefits of, of people really saying, hey, our leaders need to be they don't just need to know how to run good meetings. They also need to, have some of the, I don't know, do we still call them soft skills? That show up or don't show up. What have you seen organizationally?
Yeah, so, leaders who, in general, leaders who are more self-aware, who are actively working on their own healing, their own, trauma, they do create more supportive environments, right?
Yeah.
Some people say psychologically safe. I try to lean away from terms like safe spaces, because my personal belief is that I cannot create a safe space for another person. I can create a supportive growth environment for
Yeah.
my team or my employees. They are the ones who say whether they feel safe in that environment or not.
Yeah.
So I'll just say that. But creating those safe or those supportive environments really comes with that self-awareness and that work that you're doing on yourself. Therefore, in the organization, those employees are going to feel more like they can bring their full selves. They can, maybe voice opinions, voice risks, voice threats, voice feedback without repercussion. So now you have more trust created inside of the environment. When you have more trust created, you've got
Yeah.
more collaboration, more innovation. That all trickles down to the bottom line if you run a for-profit organization, right? So we see this in so many different ways. It could be everything from, employee retention and employee engagement to innovative new ideas, kind of think tank mentality where, again, it's all rooted in trust. And so if I feel like I can really be myself and I can voice the things in a very conscious way, that I think are going to improve the team, the work, whatever the things are that we do here, then the whole organization just feels different, right? And, when you say soft skills and I talk about feeling, these things have been historically pushed away for such a
Right.
long time because
Right.
we came from the Industrial Revolution where everything was productivity focused, factory. If somebody got sick or couldn't do a job, then we just remove them.
Yeah.
But that's very expensive today. And it's also just not the right way to do business.
Yeah.
I think part of that also comes from this different level of consciousness that we're bringing to business, that business in general is not there solely to make money, right?
Yeah.
We're here to, develop relationships, to develop our people, to see the sustainability of an organization over time.
Yeah.
And that short-sighted, very, that older, more antiquated mindset didn't think that way. It was
Yeah.
like short-term decisions, get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
So there's
People were assets.
people were assets. Yeah. Or yeah, you could say it that way. You can say it that way.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, there's a million
Yeah.
benefits of this work.
So, as fortunately, companies have become much more intentional about diversity and inclusion. Has that presented challenges for leaders who that's a new environment for them?
Sure. Sure. Of course. I mean, I think it would be I would be remiss if we didn't talk about that, right? For people who have benefited from the systems that we have been in for a very, very long time, hundreds of years, it's a new environment. And, especially some of the leaders that I work with that are, cisgender, heterosexual male, it is a new environment for them. And so again, they have to encounter their own biases, their own prejudices. That's part of the healing work, right? That's
Yeah,
part
yeah,
of there's so many different aspects of trauma and so many different aspects of how we become who we are as leaders. And we're just gathering lots and lots of information from the time that we were born up until
right.
the time of right now when we're in our leadership role.
Yeah,
So, yeah, that is something that can be challenging for them. And also, again, they have to be willing and courageous to encounter that and to engage with it if they're going to change.
yeah. And do you, I'm cisgender white 60-year-old male, right? So I think you were talking
Yep.
about me. um in some regards, do you find that
Yeah.
some of it's just lack of exposure, lack of experience, lack of knowledge, certainly an openness, but in some cases just I've never, it's almost like I don't know how to respond or react or even operate in this environment.
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. I mean, on the extreme level, it's hard to hate up close, right? So the more that you have exposure and the
Right.
more that
100%.
you feel connected to and start to understand and empathize with other people who are different from you, you're going to start to see them as human and
Yep.
not this other. And so I think that's just part of it to your
Yep.
exposure question. For
Yep.
sure. For
Yep.
sure. There are a lot of people leaders who maybe have employees who have different pronouns than they're used to. And so, if I'm encountering people like that, where it's like, oh, I just want to be honest, these pronouns,
Right,
it's
right,
really
right.
hard for me.
Right.
It's like, okay, well, then all you're lacking is practice, right?
That's
Because
right.
you
Yeah.
use they and them and their all the time in your language,
Yeah.
right? So let's talk
Yeah.
about that. Let's
Yeah.
practice that.
Yeah.
My pronouns are they, she. So
All right.
let's talk about that.
Yeah. 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 And I think that's a helpful dialogue. No question.
Yeah, especially
Uh,
when there's no judgment coming
right. 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 Right.
from
Right.
either party, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of my favorite Mr. Rogers quotes. It's hard not to like someone once you know their story.
That's it.
So,
Oh, I just got chills. I love Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers did a lot of good for
who
us.
doesn't?
Yeah.
So tell me how you work with somebody. I just typically somebody, probably there are a variety of ways, but what's a typical engagement that somebody would say we need to bring Kelly in?
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends. There could be some conflict among a leadership team, and in some cases, I'm working with the entire leadership team. In those situations, I'm coaching each of the leadership team members individually, and we're also doing group sessions. Depending upon where they are, the group sessions sometimes can be in person. And, I'm pretty close to New York City. So if that is available, then we will do that for part of the in-person, group team sessions. But it's really about, in the one-on-one sessions, feels more like therapy than anything
Yeah.
else,
Yeah.
right? Because we're
Sure.
talking about the business, but we're talking about how does the leader show up in ways that um, that they aren't necessarily proud of or that they would like to change, right? Or if
Mhm.
they're complaining about someone, we flip that around and we say, okay, well, how is that situation mirroring some way in which you want to be different? Or why is that the behavior of this employee or this other leadership team member, why is that actually rubbing on you? Right? Like, what is it about them that you actually see in yourself? And they're like, I didn't think about that. Right.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
in order to have those kinds of conversations, you just need to be willing and courageous.
It's interesting. You refer to it as therapy, and I imagine in a lot of ways it is for people because we don't often get the opportunity to actually look at that, to have somebody question us on like, well, have you thought about why that exists? I mean, because we're just a bundle of reactions half the time, right? And so the
Yeah.
idea that somebody's asking us to think about how something occurred and how it could be different. I'm sure you get two types. I'm sure you get some resistance to that, and I'm sure you also get people that are like, this is the first time I've been able to explore this.
Yeah. I think more often it's the latter, only because by the time someone is seeking out coaching, and particularly the kind of coaching that I do,
Yeah.
they're self-aware enough to say,
Yeah.
I think the problem might be me. And like, I really think that in order to work through this conflict or help the organization as a whole, we need to change, or maybe they're in a period of transformation with the company or the organization. They're self-aware enough to say, yeah, I think part of the stumbling block or part of what needs to actually evolve here is me. And that's the interesting thing about coaching is I'm not doing anything. This is
Right,
not
right, right.
consulting, right? I'm
You're
not
not prescribing.
fixing. I'm not prescribing, definitely not prescribing. That's psychiatry. Um, but not fixing. I'm holding these clients as whole and complete and perfect as exactly who they are.
Yeah.
What I'm doing is empowering them to figure out what they want to change and how they want to get there, like what that looks like for them. And I'm really just holding that space and asking them very poignant questions to try to get them to think differently without an agenda,
Right.
right? So sometimes a leader might come to me and say, I don't know which way I want to go. Do I want to stay in this organization or do I want to actually exit? And I say from the beginning, I don't have an agenda here, right? Like, whichever way you go, that's what I'm supporting. And we navigate that together. And sometimes, we're together anywhere from 6 months to 18 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Kelly, I appreciate you taking a few moments to stop by the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast. Is there somebody or someplace you would invite people to connect with you and obviously find out more about Heal to Lead?
I mean, everything about my work and the book is all on my website. Obviously, with my background in marketing, I wanted to make that easy. So website is just klcampbell.com.
Awesome. Well, again, I appreciate you stopping by. Hopefully, we'll run into you one of these days out there on the road.